Welcome to the Forest of Thought with me, Ingrid Rieser. I was born into a world where many of the things that are most important to me, like art, beauty, relationships, embodied experience, love, the sacred, are not really considered very important to our understanding of the cosmos. They're thought of as extra fluff, rather than being at the core of our existence and our reality. One of the thinkers who sought to create a science more attuned to these philosophical questions was mathematician turned philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. In the early 20th century, this really radical time when quantum and relativity theory had begun to undermine the old mechanistic view of physics, Whitehead developed his process philosophy, which focused on the co-creative processes of the world's becoming, and where lived experience, creativity, and a poetic God took center stage. I've always had a feeling that Whitehead has something important to teach us, and a few months ago I was lucky enough to sit down with Whitehead scholar Matthew David Segall and begin to unpack Whitehead's philosophy and what it might mean for us today.
Whitehead wants to say, actually, if we want to contact what's most basic, we should really get in touch with our visceral feelings, he says, with our moods, with our emotional fluctuations, and that actually is revelatory of the real, rather than being extraneous or fluff. Whitehead says that God's power is the worship that God inspires, which is to say, God is a poet who's giving us a vision that we could decide to realize if we want, but we have to want to realize it. And so God needs us in the sense that the universe that is divinely envisioned can't be actualized by God alone.
Matthew David Segall is a transdisciplinary philosopher and professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. His scholarship challenges dualistic and mechanistic paradigms and bridges process philosophy with contemporary science and spirituality. We talked under the plane trees outside of Pomona College, California, at a conference hosted by the Center for Process Studies. So you're a professor of philosophy.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And I heard you say before that philosophy is more than a job for you, that it's more like a way of life.
Yeah.
So can you say something about that and maybe how you came to be doing what you're doing now?
Yeah. Well, I remember a professor of mine who has been very influential and continues to be a mentor for me. When I referred to him as a philosopher in an introduction to a talk he was giving, he was kind of embarrassed and said, "I'm not a philosopher, I'm just a professor of philosophy." And I was so confused by that. And he felt like philosopher is an honorific title that should be given to you by someone else. But I've always related to the term as, you're not calling yourself a sage. You're not saying you're wise. You're saying you're in love with wisdom and you're seeking wisdom. You're not claiming to have it. And so I don't feel like it's hubristic. And so, I am willing to adopt the title. And, philosophy as more than just a profession and as more than just a way of sort of solving abstract puzzles and linguistic analysis and all these things that it's become in the academy for the most part, to me is just beside the point. Not that it can't be interesting in some cases, but it's not philosophy in the ancient sense where it's a spiritual practice. It's a way of life and a way of existing in relationship to the mystery of life. And I have been walking that path for a long time. I often tell the story of being a 7-year-old and confronting my mother's death, being really torn up about that, and then realizing soon thereafter that I was going to die and having a totally different relationship to that, my own death, because it seemed far more impossible that consciousness should just end. My identity might transform, but that consciousness should just end didn't make sense to me. And so as a 7-year-old, I didn't have the language for it, but I was looking back already beginning to inhabit life in a philosophical way. Plato has Socrates say in the Phaedo, just before he drinks the hemlock, he says philosophy is preparation for dying. And I constantly am reminding myself of that. And not that death is not something tragic, but actually it's the end of life, in the sense of it's the source of the meaning of life and the purpose of life. I think if we live our lives backwards from the perspective of our death, that we might stand a better chance of being virtuous. And, becoming a professor of philosophy, I feel very lucky to have been able to get a job doing this, even though it's more than a job. I'd be doing it anyway, even if they weren't paying me.
Yeah.
Might be living in a barrel like Diogenes, but it's just my way of remaining a student forever. That's how I look at it. Never wanted to leave school, so I don't have to.
That's perfect. Your focus now is process philosophy, as far as I've understood it.
Yeah.
And so I was... I think that it seems like we're both interested in ways of understanding the world that are both intellectually rigorous, but that at the same time provide space for lived experience and the intuitive, just the way that what it feels like to be alive, and that the reductionistic, materialist, mainstream scientific view is not really included. All the things of that I consider maybe important in my life, like relationships and love and beauty and music and whatever, that's kind of extra fluff, that's sort of like not really included in the story about what the world is. Mm-hmm. And it seems like process philosophy might provide an alternative to that is more integrated. So I don't know, if for somebody who doesn't know anything about process philosophy, how would you begin to introduce it?
Yeah, it's an approach that I think we could root all the way back to the origins of philosophy, even prior to Plato, the so-called pre-Socratics or the physiologoi, like Heraclitus, who says all things flow, panto rei, you can't step into the same river twice, these sorts of ideas. He also said that the cosmos is an ever-living fire. And so this idea of ongoing transformation as the only constant and the ever-living part is already suggesting a kind of panpsychist orientation, that the universe is pervaded by feeling, as you said. And Whitehead, thousands of years later, lived through what we could call the second scientific revolution, when relativity physics and quantum physics destroyed the old mechanistic, materialistic conception, or should have. Whitehead was aware that mechanism no longer made any sense given what science itself had discovered, and he set to work trying to develop an alternative metaphysical substructure for science to replace the old mechanistic view that science began with in the 17th century, Western science at least. And for Whitehead, rather than think of emotion and value and all of the things that Galileo dismissed as mere secondary characteristics that weren't the primary material, measurable things that physics is supposed to be interested in, Whitehead wants to say, actually, all of that qualitative feeling and affective and value sorts of realities are fundamental to the universe. And if we want to know what's most if we want to contact what's most basic, we should really get in touch with our visceral feelings, he says, with our moods, with our emotional fluctuations, and that actually is revelatory of the real, rather than being extraneous or fluff and frosting, right? And that is very challenging for the sort of materialistic engineering mindset that has engaged in scientific inquiry in order to really gain mastery and control over the world. The kind of science that Whitehead wanted to inaugurate would be more about entering into enduring relationships with the world. And so knowledge becomes about building alliances with other types of beings, and the more secure and reciprocal that those alliances are, then the more valid the knowledge that can be gained would be, right? And so when a molecular biologist or biochemist is trying to understand microorganisms, the knowledge produced isn't just something that the scientist is extracting, but it's actually something co-created by the scientists, the human beings in the laboratory, and the microorganisms that they're working with, right? And so it's just a more collaborative understanding and an interspecies understanding of what knowledge would be. And so, yeah, it's more integrative, as you said, and I would even say integral, which is, my university is founded on this idea of integral philosophy and integral yoga that comes out of the work of Sri Aurobindo, this Indian revolutionary turned yogi. He died in 1950, and one of his students was the first president of our school, Haridas Chaudhary. And the idea of integral, as Aurobindo understood it, is like integral education would bring together body, mind, and spirit, right? And that spirit needs the body just as the body needs the spirit, and intellect is only one aspect of what a full appreciation of the nature of reality would require. We also need some sense of transcendence and also immanence. We need some sense of the somatic and as much as the spiritual, and that these aren't opposed, dualistic, separate realities, but fully integrated and mutually arising. And so in an educational context, that means that our feelings, our emotions, our intuitions, our imagination, kinesthetic, movement-based ways of knowing, these are all crucial ingredients for actually coming to know and understand the world. They're not secondary to the typical academic focus on mind or intellect.
Yeah. And so I guess those skeptical of that will say that it just becomes that it's impossible to do science in that way or something like that, because it's you cannot be systematic in the same way. But even though, like you said, that seems to have been exactly what Whitehead was trying to do. But if we just jump back a little bit to Whitehead himself, because I guess he was fairly well known in his time, but now he's not really somebody that people know about. So could you say a little bit about him and like what his philosophical project was about, and then we can jump back into what you were just saying?
Yeah, so he was a mathematics student at Cambridge University at Trinity College, and quickly excelled and became a professor there, and he taught for 25 years. Bertrand Russell was one of his students and quickly became a collaborator. They wrote the Principia Mathematica together in the first decade of the 20th century, which was in many ways inaugurated the new analytic approach to philosophy, which continues to dominate in academic philosophy today. But yeah, and so in the 19-teens, this guy that people probably have heard of, Albert Einstein, was gaining notoriety because of his special theory of relativity. And Whitehead had always been he was a mathematician, but he was very interested in applied math or physics, how the relevance of mathematics, different models, geometries and whatnot to the physics of space and time. And so he got very interested in this revolution that was underway as a result of what Einstein was proposing. And apparently Whitehead was one of the few mathematicians in the English-speaking world who could understand the four-dimensional geometry that Einstein was working with, and Minkowski and others. And so he started drifting out of math and actually didn't finish the Principia with Russell. There was supposed to be a fourth volume. Only 3 were published. And Whitehead started attending this series of conferences that the Aristotelian Society organized, and figuring out what relativity meant for philosophy. Is this an idealist? Does this have idealist implications, or is this is there some other metaphysics which could make better sense of this? Whitehead never wanted the idealists to be able to capture the flag. He was a realist, but an experiential realist, right? And so he didn't want these new models in physics to do violence to our common sense experience. He wanted to find a way of integrating the best science and physics with the sort of hardcore common sense presuppositions of human life. Like we have agency, that consciousness is an intrinsic part of the natural world. And so he was sort of forced into retirement at Cambridge. He had been earlier in his life. So he was teaching in London in the 19-teens, teaching astronomy. But by the 1920s, having made a name for himself as a philosopher, he was 63, I believe, when Harvard University invited him to come to the U.S. to teach philosophy. And so fall of 1924, he gives his first philosophy course and admits that this is the first philosophy course he's ever been in, and now he's the instructor. So he found it kind of odd. But he had been developing his ideas for decades and finally had the opportunity to work it out in class. And now we have his students' lecture notes, which have recently been published, so we can really see his mind in action. For Whitehead geeks, it's super exciting to be able to do that. And in 1925, he publishes Science in the Modern World, which is both a history of science and the first time he really articulates his metaphysics, what he calls an organic realism. And so he reimagines the nature of nature as fundamentally from subatomic particles on up to galaxies and superclusters of galaxies as really an ecology of organisms. And he says biology is the study of the larger, or we could say the middle-sized organisms. Physics, particle physics, is the study of the smaller organisms. You could say astrophysics is the study of the much larger organisms, stars, galaxies, and so on. An organism for him just means a self-organizing system that has a horizon of experience. And, for Whitehead he was already aware of this issue with the materialist philosophy, that it really didn't leave any place for consciousness in nature. And so the scientists themselves who were, devising these materialistic, mechanistic models of the universe really have no place in the universe they're describing, right? And so you're either left with an incoherent dualism, or you're left having to somehow explain away consciousness, which doesn't make much sense because without conscious organisms, there shouldn't be any science, right? So there's a lot of muddle-headed thinking would be Whitehead's phrase for it. And he tries to begin working that out in Science in the Modern World, but he wasn't done there. He writes Process and Reality in 1929, and it's one of the, I think, the greatest systematic metaphysical treatise in the 20th century that really brings together not only science and all of the special sciences, physics, biology, sociology, but religious experience as well, and aesthetics and the arts. He was truly an integral thinker in that sense, bringing science, religion, and art back into a comprehensive view of the cosmos. And I would say we're still catching up to him now. But he was articulating his metaphysics in the wrong season. Just as Process and Reality is coming out in the late 1920s, Heidegger publishes Being and Time. Wittgenstein had published the Tractatus several years earlier than that. And that both of those texts in different ways were an attempt to move philosophy away from metaphysics and away from the idea of a grand system. And Whitehead does system in a unique way, open-ended and flexible and empirically grounded and so on. But philosophy just became increasingly either analytic or phenomenological, which, coming out of Heidegger's work, which kind of bracketed the question of understanding nature and the cosmos at large and was more oriented towards how can human beings describe our own experience and our own situatedness and so on. Mm-hmm. And so for most of the last century, Whitehead has been marginalized, but I think that's starting to change. Mm-hmm. He's becoming more popular all of a sudden. Yeah.
Maybe his time is now. Well, so just to backtrack a little bit, he, like you said, there is this problem that we've been grappling with since Descartes, or even longer, I don't know, about where we have this idea about the mind and the spirit as being eternal, separate, and then we have the body, which is not connected to that in any way. And like you said, if we are going to explain the workings of the physical world according to these mechanistic laws that then are challenged, like you said, by relativity and quantum theories, then so much of the experience of what it is to be a human alive at the moment is not really integrated in that. And so that was what seems so interesting about Whitehead. And could you say something more about his view on experience? Because you say, I think you said previously that he might be categorized as described as a pan-experientialist.
Mm-hmm.
But how can we think about experience as integrative of this cosmological view of the universe that Whitehead is laying out?
Yeah, it's challenging because usually experience and consciousness are things we would associate with, well, human beings. Maybe most people are probably comfortable saying that mammals are conscious, probably birds. Where you start to get disagreements would be like, well, what about insects, plants, single cells? I think more and more biologists are comfortable saying that even single-celled organisms have some kind of sentience, though that's not universal. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to attributing experience beyond the biological world to atoms and galaxies and stars and so on, yeah, that can make people feel like this is a bit anthropomorphic. Mm-hmm. And actually, the Whitehead scholar, the late David Ray Griffin, who helped found the Center for Process Studies, he articulated this. He came up with the term pan-experientialism to distinguish Whitehead's view from panpsychism, in an attempt to head off. And
panpsychism, just for those who aren't familiar.
Pan meaning all, and psyche meaning soul or mind, would be to say that, all things have some psyche or some soul aspect to them, some kind of interiority. And David Ray Griffin was worried that psyche or soul was too associated with consciousness, and so he thought the term experience, which Whitehead uses, might be more neutral, and that we could understand, as Whitehead counseled us to understand, that most experience is not conscious. And so Whitehead really did feel that human consciousness was quite derivative and somewhat peripheral in the cosmos. Maybe higher mammals and human beings have this consciousness thing, but rather than think of it as the highest or the best, it was more actually of a limit. Consciousness narrows our experience and our focus onto very high abstractions, actually, which can be useful. But he wanted to articulate a deeper understanding of experience as, again, not conscious, but more about the transmission of feelings from moment to moment, so that we can understand how an occasion of experience in its most basic and generic sense just involves inheriting a past, sort of feeling the push of the past, and anticipating a future, feeling the lure or the pull of what could be, anticipating what could happen next. And he would say that, even a photon, even an electron, is just by virtue of being involved in a causal network, inheriting a past and anticipating a future. And the breadth or depth, if you want, of the tension between inheriting a past and anticipating a future expands as the experience or the beings experiencing become more complex in terms of, with organisms, as the physiology and nervous systems get more and more complex. It's as though that the duration of the tension being held between past and future broadens, dilates, right? And so you could say that at the higher degrees of dilation, you get something like consciousness, but that at the level of a photon or an atom or something, there's very little in the way of like time to make conscious decisions about which future to actualize or how to inherit the past.
So us thinking about where we've come from, what's come previously, and thinking about where we want to go or what's
Right.
going to happen. That's an example of that kind of dilation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so with human beings, conscious experience grants us the capacity to stretch back indefinitely into the past and indefinitely into the future. Whereas, simpler experiential beings can seem more habitual in their behavior. And indeed, in physics, because of how habitual organisms at that scale tend to be, we can come up with mathematical equations that are, highly predictive. But never perfectly predictive. I mean, that's one of the things about quantum physics is we can't actually know with precision how a radioactive atom, when it will decay, or which slit the photon will go through. I mean, there's room for decision.
Yeah.
in
Does
minimal
this
form.
could this be related to what Rupert Sheldrake has talked about, that instead of thinking about natural laws as governing the universe, it's more like habits?
Exactly.
Or that they can be extremely deeply ingrained, but
Right.
that are not necessarily unbreakable laws in that
Exactly.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Habit would be the more organic Whiteheadian way of thinking about law.
So, because I wanted to ask you also about, it's very interesting how he brings God into his metaphysics, but also this concept of concrescence, which is his word, which has been new to me. So I'm not sure in which order is best to introduce those two things, but maybe I'll leave it up to you if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, I could combine the answer. I
Yeah.
mean, for Whitehead, God would be the principal example of the process of concrescence. So he has a whole theology, but in his metaphysics, he wants to make sure that his account of the nature of the divine is subject to the same sort of categories as his account of any other entity, right? So God isn't an exception to the rest of the metaphysics, but an example of the metaphysics. And so with this core concept of concrescence, which is the process by which the past grows together into a new moment of experience and achieves a perspective on the universe which is totally unique in all of history, and then perishes to offer itself for the next round of concrescence. The only difference between God and every other concressing creature is that God's concrescence is everlasting. And so God's life, you could say, is imperishable. And all of our finite experiences and finite concrescences are occurring within that divine life. And, concrescence is actually not a new word. It's a Latin term and literally just means to grow together. And it's this iterative and cumulative process that allows not only for a kind of holographic understanding of the universe where each part contains the whole, but because he's a process thinker, he's throwing that into motion, right? So it's not just that each part contains the whole, it's that as each concrescence occurs and the whole history of the universe is particularized into a new individual, as I said before, that new individual perspective then perishes, right? And there's an accumulation of concrescences over the course of the history of the universe, which then feeds into the next round of concrescence. And so it allows for a process of evolution, you could say. And I've described it as almost a generalization of Darwin's account of evolution, where, for Darwin, you have variation, reproduction, selection, or variation, selection, reproduction. And in Whitehead's account of concrescence, there is this process of reproduction that's inheriting the past, but there's always a bit of novelty in each concrescence. Whitehead would refer to it as the ingression of possibility, so that this isn't just repetition of identical, of what has already occurred in the past. There's a confirmation to what has occurred, but then some ingredient of novelty in the mix, and so variation occurs. And unlike Darwin, who tended to view selection as something that happens, that the organism is passive and it's the environment that's doing all the selecting, Whitehead would grant the organisms some capacity for selection themselves. Darwin does that in his account of sexual selection, where it doesn't matter what the organism wants. But for the most part, he tended to emphasize this external sort of passive selection of the environment through the death penalty, basically. If an organism's variation doesn't fit into the environment, then they don't reproduce because they die. Whitehead wants to grant more agency and selective capacity to these concressing organisms.
And is this concrescence, it's so continuous that it's like, is it, or how would you sort of describe that?
It's continuous and discrete.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry for the paradox,
no,
but it's so, Whitehead admits that metaphysics is about coming up with categories that should be adequate to our experience in the sense that they elucidate that experience. But, nothing a language using animal comes up with in an attempt to describe what's happening is ever going to fully capture what's happening. But metaphysics has an important role to play because we are language using organisms, and we ask these questions and we form our values based on the sorts of answers we can come up with. And Whitehead would say metaphysics is an experiment on language. Every science has its instruments. The instrument of metaphysicians is language itself, and so concrescence is an experiment with language to try to come up with a more logically coherent and experientially adequate way of describing what is happening. And so concrescence is the process whereby the many potentialities of the past grow together into one new actuality, which then perishes to become one of the many potentialities to be inherited by the next occasion of experience that concresses. And so there's a discreteness to that. Whitehead did think that the universe is composed of individual perspectives. But what is an individual perspective? It's a growing together of the many perspectives which have been achieved in the past already. And so it's just as communal in that sense as it is individual. But he didn't want to lose sight of either side of that pole. Right? Individuals are made of their relations to others, and each of those others is an individual, and so it's both concrescence generates new individuals, which as soon as they have achieved their perspective, they perish to become part of the collective that will be inherited by the next individual to arise out of that collection. So it's paradoxical, but does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay, good.
And if anything, it provides sort of a new image to think with in terms of, which can feel more, like you said, satisfactory to the experience of living.
Right.
And could you say a little bit more about his idea of God in this context? Because it seems like it must have been quite different to the sort of theological God of his contemporaries. That's not really what he's talking about.
Yeah, so Whitehead's very critical of the traditional monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, because he thinks that there's a kind of idolatrous view of God that was a result of projecting our more human conceptions derived from these ancient hierarchical civilizations where there's a pharaoh or Caesar, some kind of dictator at the top of the pyramid, that rules over everyone, and that we, the West, let's say the Abrahamic faiths have tended to imagine God in the image of Caesar, or Pharaoh, emperor of the universe. And he thinks that's idolatrous, and that there's actually another image of the divine in Scripture that should be emphasized more. And for him, he'll describe this other image of God as the fellow sufferer who understands, a God that dwells on the tender elements in the world and whose power is love and persuasion rather than coercion and force. And so Whitehead's God is not all powerful. And the way that Whitehead articulates the function of God in his cosmology is to provide a kind of limitation or valuation, probably a better term, of the realm of possibility. So there are infinite possibilities, right? He has this this term creativity to capture the infinitude of possibilities. And God is, he says, the first creature of creativity. And right away, to call God a creature is quite unorthodox. God is an important creature. God, you could say, is the primordial creature that sets the tone and like provides the bass note for the rest of creation to riff on and to improvise with. And so by providing this ordering or this evaluation of the realm of infinite possibility, every subsequent creature to arise feels creativity through God's filter, as it were. Whitehead says one way he describes this is that God holds up a mirror to each creature to reflect back to it its own greatness, what it could be. And yet each creature decides freely for itself how to respond to its situation. But there's divine help. Every finite concrescence has this divine potential to realize what is most beautiful, sort of implicit in it. But creatures are free too, and so we sometimes stray from that divine ideal, which is why history is what it is. But latent in every moment is still that potential. And God has another side in Whitehead's theology. I've been describing the primordial nature of God. There's also the consequent nature of God, which is more God as kind of a cosmic memory that doesn't let anything of value which has been achieved by creatures be forgotten, right? Because history is wreckage, ruins. And I think while the primordial nature has more of a cosmological function, it helps us understand why there should be any order and not just pure chaos in the world. I think of the consequent nature as having more of an anthropological basis. It's Whitehead providing some sense of consolation for our human desire that for atonement, and for a sense that, like, even though in the course of history it might seem like our ideals fail to manifest, the good that we can achieve still is remembered and made whole by this consequent nature of God, right? And so it's a response to our human longing for some sense of consolation, whereas the primordial nature is, I think, for Whitehead more purely, it answers a conceptual problem, which is like, why is there, if there aren't laws of nature, there's still habits and organization and some degree of harmony just in the way the universe unfolds. And so he thought that needed an explanation.
Yeah. Did he call him, did Whitehead say something about God being the poet of the world?
Yes.
Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes. God is the poet of the world, leading it by he uses the masculine pronoun.
Yeah.
But I don't think we need to
focus on that.
Do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, a poet leading the world by its vision. I don't like using the, not a personal pronoun.
Their vision?
Their vision towards truth, beauty, and goodness. The traditional Platonic transcendentals. So it's God as a tragic poet. Even he says that the highest form of beauty that can be realized in this universe is tragedy. If you say, he says that the primordial nature is like the dream of youth, and the consequent nature is the harvest of tragedy. Yeah.
What do you think he means by that? That life is tragic, or that in its most beautiful aspect it is?
Well, in the sense of Greek tragedy, that there's something, even with loss and failure, the striving for goodness and truth, despite the limitations of just existing as embodied creatures, is still beautiful, and it makes it worth it. And so it's not tragic in just the sense of, oh, this sucks. It's tragic in the sense of like, it's so beautiful, I'm brought to tears, and that even though there's loss and sufferings, there's also something that is achieved in this vision.
And the beautiful is all the more beautiful for it.
Right.
Because of that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a fragile beauty. But.
Yeah. Well, if we take Whitehead's cosmology seriously, what kind of implications does that bring? What does that mean for for society, or for science, for spirituality? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, for science, it would mean a more relational way of knowing, like I was describing earlier, building alliances with the non-human world rather than...
And that doesn't mean that we have to really get rid of the methods of science that we have today. We would just see them more as like a subset of what science is, or I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think there's a certain conception of science that is like value-free and neutral. There's no such thing as neutrality. Every fact is a function of how we attend to the world, and how we attend to the world very much depends on our values. What do I value? What do I find important? And so it would change science, because we would recognize science is a cultural activity. Science isn't a view from nowhere, and is fully rooted in history, and so is biased in various ways.
Yeah, and it would change the questions that we ask, the questions that we deem worthy of being asked as well.
Yeah. And so I think a Whiteheadian science would attend far more to the ways that research gets co-opted by the interests of corporations and militaries, and that the competition for funding creates a situation where rather than a more or less disinterested pursuit of truth, we're actually looking for payoff in some way. What will be marketable at the end of this research that we could sell as a product to the militaries of the world, or to consumers, and so that's a tremendous loss to science. I mean, I very much do want to know the truth about how things work, right? But when science is funded in that way and pretends to be value neutral, we're missing out on actually being able to uncover that truth.
And there's so many things that are not researched today because they're deemed impossible.
Right.
So it could be something like panpsychism, or all kind of things that are called things that are called pseudoscience. Since they're impossible, there's no point in funding them.
Right. Whereas, Whitehead says in Process and Reality, speaking of psi, that if his cosmology is to be taken seriously, then what we consider parapsychological just becomes psychology. Things like what gets called telepathy, he thinks that that's happening all the time, and we're just not particularly conscious of it. Certainly, basic sympathy is an example of how we come into resonance with each other, and it's before we can communicate using these mouth squeaks, we actually need to be in a kind of emotional resonance with each other, and that is a kind of a subtle. It's like an embeddedness in this subtle field of feelings that a materialist understanding of nature wouldn't allow us to make any. We don't have no way of making sense of that. And so one of the things that happens if you adopt Whitehead's metaphysics and inhabit his cosmos is that things that get called psi now are actually perfectly normal. And we would start to notice more the ways in which, it's like psychokinesis, the ability of mind to move matter. I mean, what do you call the movement of any limb? It's quite magical. How does that happen? I know there are physiological attempts. There are attempts to explain that in a materialist paradigm, but they're not particularly convincing. But in terms of spirituality, in addition to, I think, offering the Abrahamic faiths, which most of the people in the world belong to one of those three religions. I mean, mostly Christianity and Islam. There are non-theistic traditions as well, and I think Whitehead provides an account of the ultimate nature of reality, where all of the world's wisdom traditions and spiritual traditions can recognize something of themselves. Like Buddhism's not theistic, and so might be drawn more to Whitehead's account of creativity, and but certainly there's this notion in Whitehead's cosmology of interrelationship and dependent co-arising and so on. So I think there's plenty there for Buddhists to find resonance with. And in terms of the theistic faiths, accepting that God is a creature is a tough one. I have found in speaking to Christians and Muslims and Jews, and accepting that God is not omnipotent is an even bigger challenge, because I think a lot of people turn to these faiths in search of some kind of large and in charge being that can make it all okay. As long as you're on their team, you're one of the good ones, then you're safe, right? You've got the biggest, strongest sky daddy on your side. And that's a very kind of tribalist and childish way of relating to the divine. I think maybe that's offensive to some people, but I think it's important that we grow up out of that idea that we need some big being to save us. I think Whitehead's vision of the divine as actually needing us is far more compelling.
Say something more about that.
Whitehead says that God's power is the worship that God inspires, which is to say, God is a poet who's giving us a vision that we could decide to realize if we want, but we have to want to realize it. And so, to the extent that our will is guided by love, then we are manifesting God's will in the world. And so God becomes more powerful as a result of our loving action in the world. And to the extent that we are full of hate and fear, God's power is diminished, right? And so God needs us in the sense that the universe that is divinely envisioned can't be actualized by God alone. And I find that to be far more motivating than the traditional monotheistic view of a God separate from the world who created the world by fiat out of nothing for no other reason than to torture us. Like, it's just odd to imagine that view of things. A God of limited power who needs us is just a far more compelling spiritual vision for me. And I like to think that it will catch on more as our species matures. And I think the Earth is moving into a phase where it's going to mature us one way or another, because the forms of stability that we have grown used to during the Holocene since 12,000 years ago, when the climate changed to make agriculture and the rise of civilization possible. We left the last ice age. That period of stability is ending, and it's going to require a lot of soul searching among human beings if we're going to survive. And I think maybe we'll be more amenable to this process vision when our former sources of a security we took for granted is no longer there.
I was going to ask you what you feel that thinking with Whitehead, or, as you said, inhabiting his cosmos, how that can inspire us in our personal lives. But I think that you already said something about that. I don't know if you want to add something.
The idea of personal identity in a process relational cosmos becomes a very interesting question, because Whitehead's inviting us to recognize that we're new in each moment. And I find it quite compelling to recognize that my own relationship moment by moment, my relationship to my own past moment by moment, is not different in kind from my relationship to you or to any other person. There's a difference in the degree of intimacy. Like, I have a much more intimate memory of my own past than I have of your past, and vice versa. And yet, whenever we meet someone new, become friends, in more intimate relationships, those streams of identity become more and more fused, and that actually, while we are individuals, that individuality is so profoundly relational and entangled with everybody and everything we come into relationship with. And there's something very Buddhist about it, but also a way of preserving a kind of individuality and communion, let's say, and being able to recognize that we are new in each moment. I think it's tremendously liberating, particularly if one has suffered trauma in the past, and we easily get stuck in stories about who we think we are. And it's just, this view is just an invitation to remember that each moment there is this divine injection of possibility that can offer us an alternative to what we think we are, because what we were is not what we are, and we can always become something different. And I find that to be a tremendous source of buoyancy in life, that no matter what has happened, the future is open-ended. It's not determined. We're not stuck. The only thing we know for sure is that something new is going to happen. And the conference we're at is called "Is It Too Late?" And do we have every reason to believe it is too late? But the only thing I'm sure of is that we will be surprised by what happens next. Yeah.
What a good note to end on. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ingrid. This was fun.
Yeah, thanks for taking time.
No one can see it, but this is the most beautiful environment I've ever recorded a podcast in. So.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a wonderful in the dapple sunlight of the shade of these trees.
Whitehead famously said that the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. And that's where you can find Matt's work and writing at footnotestoplato.com. The link to that and other things we talk about can be found in the episode description. Thank you to the Center for Process Studies for helping to make this interview happen. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please consider supporting it by sharing it with your friends, leaving a review in your listening app, or by becoming a paying supporter on Patreon or Substack. All right, thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.